Welcome to Come Follow Me, Act in Doctrine with Mariana Richardson, Stephanie Dibbs Sorensen, and our guest this week, Patricia Ovison. Today we will be discussing Doctrine and Covenants, Section 1. Well, Stephanie and Patricia, it is so wonderful being with you. I'm so excited to start our discussion of Doctrine and Covenants. As a matter of fact, Patricia, we were talking about how leaving the Book of Mormon, in some ways, we're a little reluctant to let go of it because of the familiar stories and how easy it is to teach our children. I know, what was your thought on that?
Yeah, I've talked to some friends about this too, and I feel like we have to almost change our mindset. And because when we were doing the Book of Mormon, it was kind of the pilot program for Come Follow Me, and it was the comfortable book for us to teach to our children. It had the narratives. You know, my 6-year-olds love to put on the dress-ups and act out the stories. And now, you know, we have this doctrine with a story behind it, and we're going to have to kind of bring that out and teach differently. And it's going to be a bit of a challenge, maybe.
And I know, Stephanie, you also had a really important point in terms of that.
Yeah, I just think that the Doctrine and Covenants, we can still use them hand in hand. Both of them are the books of the Restoration. They're what came through the prophet Joseph Smith. They helped establish the church again, kind of set forth the doctrine, come out of the apostasy. And so I think they're great tools that we can still kind of use together and value equally.
Well, I'm excited to maybe bring in some of the things that we've learned from the Book of Mormon as we continue to study the Doctrine and Covenants. Because just like you said, Stephanie, I think the two are part of the restoration, and we need to make sure that we understand both together. Well, we are so lucky to be able to talk about the preface today because in Section 1, we have a very special voice of the Lord. A matter of fact, President Joseph Fielding Smith said that the Doctrine and Covenants is distinctly peculiar and interesting to all who believe in it, that it is the only book in existence which bears the honor of a preface given by the Lord himself. I think that's pretty interesting, especially when we think about the story that kind of started this preface. Basically, at the beginning, when they were going to talk about publishing the Book of Commandments at that time, the Doctrine and Covenants was called, they asked Oliver Cowdery, Sidney Rigdon, William McLellin to actually write a preface. And so they did. They wrote one, and they brought it to the church leadership, and the church leaders didn't like it. They kind of tore it apart. They said, oh, you know, this is wrong. Oh, we don't like that comment, to the point where they took it to the prophet and said, what should we do? And so Joseph Smith took it to the Lord, and the Lord gave him this preface. But the Lord also gave the suggestion of having somebody there, one of the church leaders, try it again. Try writing a preface and comparing the two. And so William McLellin, who thought he had pretty good facility of language and a good writer, he tried to write another preface. But even he, after writing it and spending a lot of time, realized it did not compare to the Lord's preface. As a matter of fact, the Lord says in verse 6, behold, this is mine authority and the authority of my servants, and my preface unto the book of my commandments. And at the very end of this wonderful section, he also kind of makes sure that we understand that these are his words. And he says, what I, the Lord, have spoken, I have spoken, and I excuse not myself, and though the heavens and the earth pass away, my word shall not pass away, but shall all be fulfilled, whether by mine own voice or by the voice of my servants, it is the same. For me, that's pretty significant, that it's the Lord's voice, but also the voice of his servant.
Yeah, and I think it's really powerful, too, that with the Lord setting this up as a preface for his whole book, that he's kind of saying, look, here are the things that you're going to need to be paying attention to as you read, and this is why I even have this book. And he's also, like you pointed out, he's claiming that this is being done under his authority. And that's huge because now we're not just dealing with the restoration of the church, but we're dealing with the restoration of priesthood authority. We're dealing with the restoration of the idea of having a prophet, someone that can speak in his name and with his authority. Elder Bednar, he gave a talk about the importance of authority, and he said one of the defining features of the Church of Jesus Christ, both anciently and today, is his authority. there can be no true church without divine authority. And so this is exciting because here on page 1, the Lord's saying, this is my authority, my preface, and everything that's going to be revealed here is going to be under that direction. And then as we feed into this verse 4, it says, the voice of warning shall be to all people. And typically, I think, we see a lot of this warning voice throughout this section, and we'll see it as we go through the Doctrine and Covenants. And while it can be off-putting a little bit, it's important to realize that that's the role of the prophets. He says, these disciples, by the mouths of these my disciples whom I have chosen. I teach living prophets, and I love the concept of living prophets. I'm just so grateful that we have authorized servants that can speak for the Lord again. This is such a blessing of the whole restoration in itself. And so how can we pay attention to these warnings? If that's the purpose of the Doctrine and Covenants, we've got to look for that. We've got to see it. And one thing that I love is that President Eyring gave a talk once called Safety in Counsel. He pointed out the way that we can recognize those warnings and how we should respond to them as well. He said, one of the keys to recognizing those warnings is that they are repeated. The Apostle Paul wrote, in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall every word be established. One of the ways we may know that the warning is from the Lord is that the law of witnesses, authorized witnesses, has been invoked. When the words of prophets seem repetitive, that should rivet our attention and fill our hearts with gratitude to live in such a blessed time. I just love that because when we are reading in the scriptures or listening to the teachings of living prophets, you can recognize that's being said again, right? Can you guys think of any time when you've had an experience where you've heard the words of prophets and kind of felt this specific warning and that you needed to act on that?
Well, I was thinking about this just recently. We lived in Seattle for many years, and while we lived in Seattle, you always have to worry about these windstorms that come through, and the big fir trees come down and they take out your power for sometimes weeks. And so I was thinking about the prophet's warning about having food storage and electricity and, some kind of power. And so I went and got my food storage already and made sure that I was set and ready for the possible outage. And within a little while after, we did have one of those windstorms, and it was a couple of weeks without any electricity. It was interesting after this happened, I went to the grocery store, and everything was gone. People were hoarding. They were just making sure because they didn't know how long this was going to happen.
Yeah.
I was amazed and happy that I had listened to the voice of warning and that I had my food storage ready.
And you were prepared. You were prepared because the teachings from the prophets were brought to you by the Holy Ghost, and you can kind of know that's important to act on. I'm so grateful that the prophets are willing to give us these messages and warn us when the Lord has something he wants us to hear.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. And I remember that Elder Eyring talk as well. And I feel like it's kind of says a lot about mortals and all of us, that we need to hear things more than once for us to really listen to it. Yeah. And we do that to our children. We repeat things over and over and over. And it's usually the important things that we're repeating. And so, well, when I initially read section 1, I had to read it a few times. And because initially I felt that warning voice felt too bold, and I wasn't used to that. And it felt like I needed a gentler message in a way. And but as I read it more, I realized that that's exactly what the Lord needed to do at the time. And the boldness is contrasted with the humility of the messenger. And as I thought about it, when in the section, in the inasmuch section of section 1, it talks about what the Lord was requiring of his messenger, of his prophet at the time. And he says that these commandments are of me and were given unto my servants in their weakness, after the manner of their language. And then inasmuch, he says, and inasmuch as they were humble, they might be made strong and blessed from on high. I love that so much because it really taught me how in all of our lives, we're going to be asked, the Spirit is going to prompt us to give bold messages. And we need to be able to do that with such humility. And the pattern that the Lord is setting is this idea that when you are weak and humble, then you're able to deliver these bold messages, and they're able to be listened to and better received because of that. I don't know, do you see that pattern in your lives of sort of weakness?
Oh, definitely.
There's a pattern of weakness.
I definitely know what it feels like with the weakness, but then relying on the Lord's help and making sure that the Lord knows that I am relying on Him to help me give this message. So if the message really isn't coming from me, it is actually coming from Him.
Yeah, and that's what makes this so powerful, is because Joseph Smith couldn't have said this. And that testimony of that is such, I don't know, it gives you such peace, because then you can see that even in your own weakness, that you'll be able to deliver words of power.
And I think that leads perfectly into the next takeaway I wanted to talk about, which was how the prophets are a voice of warning. That's their duty. That's their responsibility. But we also have responsibility sometimes to be a voice of warning. It requires humility on our part. And we sometimes have to tell children, or if we have a calling where we need to kind of say, hey, everyone in my relief society or whatever, we can do better. We need to step up and do better or something. That voice of warning, we have to have humility to be able to speak boldly what we're being prompted to say. Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's the second part of the humility, is the receiving it with humility. And like Spencer Kimball's statement, humility is teachableness, and I love that so much, because there's a mirror thing that happens, how you give your message to somebody, it often is mirrored in the way someone receives it. And so when you're giving something with love, it can be received with love. If you're giving something in anger, it automatically induces anger. Yeah. And so the fact that these men wanted, showed such great humility, and Joseph Smith showed such great humility, then it allows us to be humble in our searching and in our learning about what the Doctrine and Covenants is about.
I completely agree, and it's interesting that the Lord at the end of this section commands us to, in verse 37, search these commandments, for they are true and faithful, and the prophecies and promises which are in them shall all be fulfilled. The reason why I mention that is because all of us will be searching for questions and answers during this time with the Doctrine and Covenants. That's something that all of us will be doing. And yet, it is hard to kind of do that search, but the search can be fun. Forrest Fenn is a wonderful story that I love to tell, in that when he turned 80, he decided that he would start a treasure hunt. He got a treasure box, he filled it full of gold coins, gold nuggets, and he hid it somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. Now, when he did it, he told the world that he had put that there. And basically 250,000 people, they estimate, just started searching all over the Rocky Mountains trying to find this treasure. About a couple of years into this, basically Forrest Fenn wrote an article, and he was worried because a lot of people were risking their life looking in kind of dangerous places. Yeah. And he said, first of all, it is not hidden in a dangerous place. And second, he also said the search is supposed to be fun. Well, it took about 10 years, and finally it was found. Just this past summer, somebody did find the treasure. But I love those two words of advice that Forrest Fenn gave all of us, especially when we're talking about the Doctrine and Covenants and our searching of these commandments. That first of all, it's not dangerous. We don't have to be afraid during the search, that we can do so with the Lord's help. Forrest Fenn gave people a map, even, and a poem that was supposed to, they were supposed to unravel the clues. Well, I think we have even more than a map. We have the Lord to be able to be by our side as we ask him questions. Now, oftentimes when we have questions, Sister Kimball, I'm so glad you mentioned, President Kimball, because Sister Kimball also said this same thing. She said, I have always had an inquiring mind. I am not satisfied just to accept things. I like to follow through and study things out. I learned early to put aside those gospel questions that I could not answer. I had a shelf of things I did not answer. But as I've grown older and studied and prayed and thought about each problem one by one, I have been able to understand them better. I think about my own life, and I have a shelf, and I know some people have mentioned how maybe their shelf is getting so full that it might break if they're not careful. But I love the idea of bringing them down, especially this year as we study the Doctrine and Covenants, that we take them off the shelf, that we study and search and really see if we can find answers to all of these questions.
Yeah.
Have you ever had that experience? Have you ever had a question that you had to bring down off the shelf?
I think that, there have been a lot of recent topics that sometimes things surge and we have to kind of revisit them and think about them. I know that for myself, when there was kind of a lot of questions about women in the priesthood, it was a chance for me to kind of really pull that down, think about it, study it, read everything I could about the priesthood and my own covenants, and kind of come to some conclusions and things that I felt comfortable with and grew in confidence in. And it was just it sometimes even the things we know require some revisiting and reinvestigating to help us grow in confidence in those doctrines.
Oh, I agree. And I think that that's the purpose of searching, is that it's a constant process. It's an iterative process that we're able to do over and over and over again. Going back to, we were discussing, Patricia, earlier about the power of the Book of Mormon in helping us also discuss and think about and search the Doctrine and Covenants. And for me, this example of Ammon and his brothers in terms of their searching after their wonderful and glorious conversion to the gospel, for me, that is a wonderful example of also the power of searching and the priceless gifts that we can get. If we turn to the Book of Mormon in chapter 17, verse 2, it is interesting here, the sons of Mosiah are reconnecting with Alma. And Alma makes a very interesting, he's kind of worried, have they stayed faithful? Have they continued searching the commandments? He makes 3 very interesting observations about how the sons of Mosiah had improved in their searching. He said, "Therefore Alma did rejoice exceedingly to see his brethren, and what added more to his joy is they were still his brethren in the Lord, and first, they had waxed strong in the knowledge of the truth. Second, they were men of a sound understanding. And third, they had searched the scriptures diligently that they might know the word of God." So these are 3 priceless gifts that they had received because of their searching. And in the same way, we can have those same priceless gifts.
Well, and I love that story too, because I think how happy the reunion was. Oh, and, having known them not making good choices, and then to be actively searching, it must have just been such a happy thing.
And isn't that the power of searching too, is the process of repentance and change that we can have during this search, which I think is also such a great example of Ammon and his brothers.
Mm-hmm.
I love this part that it says in verse 38, because it goes back to the idea of the prophets, but it also about searching and looking for things. And it says, "Whether by mine own voice or by the voice of my servants, it is the same." And I love that because we can read that. We can read this Doctrine and Covenants knowing that it's coming from the Lord, and that we can do the same thing as we listen to living prophets.
I love that too.
Yeah, and I think when people think of section 1, that's the phrase that comes to mind.
Search these commandments. There we go. Yeah.
And that's the reason why. Well, I want to thank you both for these amazing takeaways. They've so touched my life, touched my heart, touched my mind. But along with that, as we come to the end, I do want us to think of a call to action, something that we can do from all of this. I'm also thinking, as we talk about call to action, I think of Doctrine and Covenants, section 101, verse 78. And for me, this idea of act in doctrine is basically what we're talking about when we say a call to action. And the verse says that every man may act in doctrine and principle pertaining to futurity, which means future events, according to the moral agency which I have given unto him, that every man may be accountable for his own sins in the day of judgment. For me, this is the essence of a call to action, that we have moral agency.
Yeah.
We have the ability to make the choice as to whether we're going to do it or not.
We do something.
We need to do something, and we need to follow up.
Yeah.
And so we're hoping that we can also follow up with each other as we meet together again to talk about the next section or next part that we're discussing. I personally would like to kind of put out there President Nelson's invitation that he gave to us in the last conference. It goes so well with what we're talking about, especially when we talk about searching and the Doctrine and Covenants. He invited us, as you study your scriptures during the next 6 months, and I would like to say the next year, let's not stop at 6 months. I encourage you to make a list of all that the Lord has promised he will do for the covenant Israel. I think you will be astounded. Ponder these promises, talk about them with your family and friends, then live and watch for these promises to be fulfilled in your own life. What do you think? Is that a good act in doctrine?
Yeah, I love it when he gave that call to action, because it's also the fact that we're going to Doctrine and Covenants. The Doctrine and Covenants is a fulfillment of a promise. And so the whole thing applies.
Yeah,
and so we should.
The Doctrine and Covenants, too, the whole thing came about because people asked questions. I mean, most of these sections were in response to questions that Joseph asked. There were prayers that were offered, or that people asked Joseph, seek out the Lord's will, and revelation came. And I think that we can follow that pattern. And the challenge that President Nelson gave helps us to do that. When he's given challenges previously, and I've done them, like when he said, study Jesus Christ in the topical guide, I had a really powerful experience, and I needed it for things that were going to be coming and happening in my life. And I'm so grateful, because I know that if we follow what he's saying, we can have that same kind of powerful experience.
Well, I do hope and pray that all of us will during our time together as we talk about these takeaways, but take it a step farther and act in doctrine. So thank you so much for helping me to understand D&C Section 1 even better.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.